In a world filled with Bigfoot podcasts, where believers and skeptics clash, one podcast stands tall, ready to separate fact from fiction. Welcome to That Bigfoot Podcast. Brian and Wayne are here to call out the hoaxers, shoot down the myths, and weed through the mountain of red circle squatches. There is no Bigfoot Kool-Aid drinking going on here. We're not here to blindly believe, but to uncover the truth about the legendary creature that has captivated the world for centuries. Each week, we'll dive deep into the evidence and share jaw-dropping insights that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about Bigfoot. So, if you're tired of the same old stories and want a podcast that separates fact from fiction, join us on That Bigfoot Podcast. Get ready for a wild ride through the mysterious world of Bigfoot. Strap in, skeptics and believers alike, because That Bigfoot Podcast is about to blow your mind. Don't miss out. Like, subscribe, and comment now, and let's uncover the truth together. That Bigfoot Podcast, where the bullshit ends and the hunt for truth begins.
That gets me fired up every single time. Welcome to the show, everybody. Thank you guys for being here tonight. What's up, Wayne? What's going on, man?
What's up, buddy? How you doing today? Been looking forward to this one for a while.
I have too, man. I am a little bit under the weather. I'll just put that out there on Front Street. I am not feeling well. I went out on my birthday on Monday, went out in the cold and went ice skating and did a whole bunch of crap I probably shouldn't have done. So I'm a little under the weather tonight, but I am a red light performer. So when the red light's on, I'm going to give you guys a show for sure. I am excited about being here. What about you, Tiffany? What's going on, co-host extraordinaire?
Oh, I know you like that. I thought that was fabulous. Well, I am, as you always say, it's one of my favorite things to hear you say, but it's so gross. I am hanging on like a hair in a biscuit.
It just gives you all kinds of horrible visuals, but it's one of the most country sayings that you can possibly use. So
this is awful.
I'm glad to have you all here. Dad Squatch, Bristol, Aaron, Charlotte J, Troy's in the house. Hello, y'all. Mr. Tent, Tennessee, Tim Lowe.
Troy. That's Troy.
Yeah. Does he have multiple personalities, or we got multiple Troys? I guess we got multiple Troys. I am looking to make sure we say hello to everybody in the chat. We'll try to keep up with that as we go along, but it is really about the psychology of Sasquatch tonight. That's really why we're here. If you guys caught it over on Sasquatch Odyssey, I put out a show a couple of weeks ago. It was Wayne and I talking to one of our esteemed PhDs that are in the house tonight, Emma Steverson from over the pond. She's over in the UK. She's staying up late, burning the midnight oil with us tonight. And if you caught that show, you kind of got some idea of where we're going to go down the rabbit hole tonight and some of the things we're going to talk about. But we'll get into that for sure. I just want to start right away with introducing our guests. We'll start with Emma. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background, and what got you interested in this Bigfoot thing to begin with?
Thank you, Brian, and happy birthday for Monday. I'm over in Wales in the UK. I'm a psychologist. I'm 56 now. I got my PhD in my early 20s. I've got quite a mixed background. Can you hear me okay? Am I coming through? And I probably sound very Welsh, so I'll try and talk a little bit slower. So I've got a very mixed background. My PhD is in a subject called theory of mind, which is about the ability of all individuals, but particularly individuals on the autistic spectrum, who can struggle to put themselves into the mind of other people. So I also listen to many Sasquatch podcasts, including Sasquatch Chronicles. I know on Wes's show, they've interviewed somebody who has suggested that possibly the Sasquatch shows autistic tendencies, which of course I was very, very interested in with my background in autism. I also teach counselling skills. I work with people with dyslexia and mental health challenges. So I've got a very broad background, but I first became interested in Sasquatch. Lots of the guests on your show will mention the In Search Of documentary. We didn't have that so much in the UK. We used to have a program called Arthur C. Clarke's Unexplained Mysteries. So I was very interested in that as a child. My father was very interested. And about the age of 6, we went to see I couldn't tell you which Bigfoot movie in the cinema. was one of the ones that was doing the rounds at the time. I was about 6, my sister was about 4. And we came out of the cinema, we went into the cloakroom, and I was so engulfed with fear. It was, as a small child, it's almost something that was instinctual, that fear reaction. So, of course, as a psychologist, I'm very interested in things like genetic memory. Within our DNA, is there the possibility, like, for example, if you were to show a kitten, a newborn kitten, quite a small kitten, a snake, they instinctively react, don't they, to a snake? It's within their DNA to react in those ways. So now looking back at that as a child, I think, is there some level of genetic memory happening? Because that level of fear that I felt was so intense. And again, listening to the podcast is so interesting for me, because I'm interested in post-traumatic stress disorder, to hear the stress reactions in so many of the witnesses. So, I'm very interested in that aspect as well.
There's a couple of things there that we'll probably touch on later on. I love the autism part of that and the PTSD as well. I want us to get into at some point in time tonight. But let's move on to John. Let's talk to John Baranchak. Let's talk a little bit about your background. What got you into the subject of Bigfoot as well?
Sure. I'm having trouble pinning down the year I got my PhD. It was sometime in the late 80s. 40 years of working in neuropsychology and pain psychology. The last 2 years of it being was strictly clinical psychology at the Veterans Administration Hospital. Similarly, when you're working with neuropsych and pain psych patients, trauma is often a big part of that. So I have a keen interest in PTSD. Before I was medically retired, I had about 5 years of boots on the ground expeditions, primarily BFRO expeditions with Lori Wade and Charlie Raymond. And of course, with Manimal Research as well, Wayne's organization. And during my second year of Bigfooting, I saw a need to bring psychologic science to the investigative process, because the investigations were primarily qualitative, yet we're trying to get the scientific community to accept Bigfoot as a species. So I felt strongly that we needed to speak the same language as the scientists. And luckily, I got my book called Psychological Horizons in Scientific Bigfoot Research in front of Doug Hychek. And Doug interviewed me on his show. The next week offered me a role in Sasquatch Legend Meets Science 2 documentary, which I'm headed up to do the filming for that about the middle of January. And then gave me my own podcast, Grasping Sasquatch, which you can see in the background. I got into Bigfoot first, initially, without even knowing it was Bigfoot. I was fishing in New Mexico, would hike back to a remote stream, and I'd get a nice, the stream was kind of cascading pools, and I would get a good pool. I could see the fish in there. I'd get about one cast in, and all of a sudden a big rock would come splashing into the pool where I was fishing and destroy that pool. So I moved on down to the next pool. Same thing happened. I called out, because I was looking around, where are these rocks coming from? I called out, hey, stop destroying my fishing. But I could never see anybody. And moved down to the next pool. Same thing happened. And every time I was on this stream fishing for trout, that's what went on. So fast forward to my life here in Rome. after working for a rehabilitation hospital for 5.5 years, they decided to get rid of all their neuropsychologists. So I started my own private practice. And I had 19 years in my private practice as a neuro and pain psychologist and expert witness, and continued my squatching adventures and during that time, and have been doing it ever since. I've got a medical condition that kept me out of the loop for about 2 years, but I'm happy to say that I'm able to at least walk a quarter mile now, which isn't very far, but it gets me back in the woods. And Wayne and I recently shared a BFRO expedition together, and just I feel closest to God in the woods, and so it was very refreshing and very invigorating to get back in the woods.
Yeah, I was so jealous I couldn't make it out on that Lori Wade expedition with you guys. Wayne talked about it. We did an entire episode of the show about it, and I was so envious. So I'm glad that you guys got to do that. There's so much to cover here. I guess I'll kick it to Wayne because I know he's got burning questions in his soul, just like I do, about some of the things that frankly really piss us off about what's going on in Bigfoot and some of the things that we face, particularly doing in interview-based shows where we interview witnesses. And after our first conversation with Emma, I came away, and I think Wayne even came away a little bit with some great ideas on things that she shared with us. I felt like a better interviewer just after that 20 or 30-minute conversation. So we can certainly get into some of that. But Wayne, I'll kick it to you. What is the burning issue for you that you want to get kicked off here and get our experts talking about here?
Yeah. First off, I mean, the first question that I want to ask, and this is something that John and I have talked about several times. You know, John and I are, I'm not hidden it at all. John and I are great friends. We've been very good friends for a couple of years now, and I can't tell you the advantages of one of your best friends being a therapist. You know, you get free therapy all the time, so that's awesome. But this whole thing of kind of the delusion of grandeur, certain people, they get this idea. I don't know how best to put it out there, but these people that have seen Bigfoot 30-something times, and they always seem to need to be in the spotlight, but they're the first ones to tell you, I'm not doing it for fame. I don't want to be famous. I don't want to make no money off of this. But they're always right there telling you what Bigfoot is, why they act the way they do, how many times they've seen them, 30 or 40 times. Why is that? Why do some people feel the need to be better than everyone else and, in my opinion, make up stories?
Let's take it one at a time. Emma, you first, and then John.
Well, I mean, it's such a good question, and obviously it's a burning question. And from my perspective, there's so many different reasons and different perspectives that you could look at answering that. So you could have an underlying psychological condition. There could be some aspect of, schizophrenia, for example. But they could, which is a condition. But you could also have things like personality disorders, such as borderline personality disorder, which is it's not a medical condition, but it's more, how would you say, traits maybe. So, for example, you could have somebody who's a compulsive pathological liar. There's a slight difference between the two. So a pathological liar could be just lying for absolutely no reason. They just enjoy the aspect of lying. But as somebody who actually believes in Bigfoot, I don't want to give the impression that I think that everyone who's going to be an eyewitness is lying. I don't think that at all. There's so many different aspects. There's the possibility that they are actually seeing Bigfoot multiple times. They are in a location where that is happening. So you can't discount that. I mean, I'm a big fan of things like thematic analysis and statement analysis. So, I'd be keen to actually record what they were saying, if possible, and to write it down and to analyze the content of the statements, because it's quite hard, even though psychological research shows that given the right opportunity, a lot of us will lie to a certain extent. Usually white lies, if you're given the opportunity and you think you can get away with it, to lie to an extreme is quite rare. And it's also quite hard to lie very well consistently. You have to be able to see things from multiple perspectives. So it's topics such as statement analysis will show in what they call leakage, often if people are lying. So, often people will say the wrong tense and give clues away. We have a vocabulary of about 20 to 30,000 words. So when we're telling any narrative, including a made-up narrative, we go into our dictionary of words that we have access to, and we pick things at rapid speed. So when people are lying, it's quite hard to hide it, and you get what you call leakage. And very often there'd be clues within the words if you can kind of analyze them and step back. It's hard to do in real time, but when you're able to record it and actually look at the words, there can be clues. So to answer your question, there's multiple reasons. It could be just attention-seeking behavior. It could be there's different within psychology. There's different aspects of psychology. So you have social psychology, all different ways of looking at things. So within social psychology, you've got the concept of wanting to be in the in-group. Now, the in-group could be a subculture, such as a very niche in-group, such as cryptozoology, etc. But it's still part of wanting to belong to the in-group. What do you think, John? Do you agree with what I'm saying, or do you see it differently?
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully you saw me sitting over here nodding my head to a lot of what you've been saying. I think the first thing I would respond to, and the point I want to make, is that while there are diagnostic categories, do you guys use the DSM over in the UK? Okay, so that's the DSM is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for psychologists and psychiatrists, and it lists all the symptoms of a variety of psychological and personality disorders. And while there's no doubt that some of the people that are engaging in this behavior may meet some of those diagnostic criteria, I think they're by far in the minority. I don't think that this is a mental health or craziness issue whatsoever. There is a delusional disorder called folie à deux, which is somebody becomes delusional and then the delusion is picked up by other people around them. I don't think that the Bigfoot community has this delusional disorder whatsoever. I believe in Bigfoot. I've had some harrowing Class B encounters, never Class A. So I'm a believer, not a knower yet. I'll know it when I see it, or when I find enough people to help me with my experiments. But I do believe, and I don't think believing in Bigfoot makes any of us crazy or pathological. I agree with Dr. Steverson that there often involves some personality characteristics that are kind of coming through. Before I jump to those, though, I think one of the most vulnerable acute or axis 1 diagnoses is a bipolar disorder. In the bipolar disorder, people become either hypomanic or manic, and that's sometimes where you see some of that grandiosity coming in that I think Wayne is asking about. Part of becoming manic or hypomanic hypomania means having manic symptoms, but just not enough of them to qualify as manic. But people can develop grandiose ideation about themselves. And, I think on rare occasions, we may see that with some of our compatriots. But for the most part, I don't believe this is a psychopathologic phenomena whatsoever. There are some personality disorders that have a lot of these characteristics. But again, I guess the main point I'm trying to emphasize is this is not a mental health condition or a delusional condition for the vast majority of believers and knowers. As far as I think she did an excellent job talking about some of the personality characteristics. I think of people with kind of dependent characteristics who need the approval of others, and as a result pander to what they think other people want to hear. And that would lead that person to exaggerate and amplify their experiences. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and also, the psychology of memory, when people are recalling things, is well known that things become exaggerated in the recall from the original encounter. But again, that's not to say that we think that people are making this up. You've only got to listen into the podcast. As a psychologist, I'm listening in, and you just hear the trauma in so many people's encounters. It's a very, very hard thing to fake. You have to be a very good actor to actually get that level of emotion across. And that's one of the things that stands out most notably to me. And again, so many people aren't coming forward for many, many years. They'll say this has happened to me 50 years ago, and it's only now that they're coming forward. So, I think from the hundreds and hundreds of podcasts that I've listened to, it's very rare that you get a sense that people are bragging when you're listening to the encounters on the shows. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm preoccupied with one person in the chat, so I gotta get this out on me. I see a lot of people that follow my show, and thank you for being here. But for those of you who don't recognize who's in that chat, we've got Michael Freeman in that chat tonight. And it's an honor that he's here, and his father produced the Freeman footage. So I just wanted to acknowledge him, and hopefully I'll be able to be a little less starstruck by him being here and kind of focus on the questions at hand. So trauma and confabulation. If you've got a dementia or some kind of traumatic brain injury, there can be damage to the memory centers of your brain, but you don't have to have brain damage to have memory lapses or memory blanks in your experience, especially when you're dealing with a Class A encounter that can be very traumatic. It's not uncommon for people that experience trauma that may or may not rise to the level of post-traumatic stress disorder, but just the trauma in and of itself can be associated with memory gaps and memory blanks. And what our brain does when that happens is it creates this sense of dissonance or an imbalance in our nervous system and in our thinking. And so our brain kind of tries to take care of that for us and fill in those memory gaps. And sometimes it'll fill in the memory gaps accurately, but in confabulation, the brain kind of fills in those memory gaps in a way that is inaccurate and doesn't necessarily make sense. And so, I think that may contribute to some of the tall tales that we experience. they don't necessarily have to be a conscious kind of thing. Although, again, I think there are people who consciously embellish, but with confabulation and these memory gaps, that's not a conscious process. That's the brain itself just kind of trying to take care of this uncomfortableness, if you will, within itself and fill in those memory gaps.
Let's talk a little bit about something that stuck out to me recently, and it's happened a couple of times to me on the show. I'm going to name 3 instances right out of the gate here that I want to get you guys to give me some input on. And this is something that I've struggled with. I do a very serious show. I take the encounters on my show very seriously. Everybody who comes on the show is treated with respect. And I started my show, Sasquatch Odyssey, to document as many encounters as possible for that very reason. I consider myself sort of a data collector, and I do it behind a microphone and getting their stories out there. But here's the rub that I have. Having a very serious show, there are tons of people out there who don't want to hear these out there stories. And I'll give you guys a couple of examples. I don't know if you've heard them, if you've listened to the show. Emma, you may be a little bit more familiar with them than John, but in and of themselves, they are pretty much the same. I sat on an episode where I interviewed a gentleman who claimed to have had sex with a female Sasquatch while on a camping trip, right? There was a couple of interviews that I've had recently. One of them comes to mind. Bridget's interview comes to mind. She has had multiple experiences and abductions with gray aliens, and she's had a Class A roadside crossing experience with a Sasquatch where she believes that she had a mind speak incident where the Sasquatch basically told her that it was there to kill her because of her connection with the grays, and it basically sacrificed itself for her because they were both having struggles. It's a whole drawn out story. Now that hasn't aired yet. Her episode will be out in a couple of weeks here on Sasquatch Odyssey, or over on Sasquatch Odyssey. But I said all that to say, I'll just we may throw the sex with the Sasquatch story out with the bathwater, but let's focus on Bridget's story. I asked her at the end of her hour-long interview. She said to me, she told me a lot of her experiences, not all of them, but a lot of them. And I simply said, I was taking notes feverishly as she was talking for an hour. And I came to the end of the interview and I just looked at her and I said, Bridget, you got to understand that my listeners are going to hear your experience. And most of them are going to say you are batshit crazy, or you completely made up your entire hour-long interview, right? It's one of the two. And here's what she said to me. She looked me right in the eye and she said, Brian, I have written affidavits from people, and she's written a 90-page PDF. I'm going to eventually put that out on the show as well. She's read that into an audio form, and I'm going to put that out there because she wants her entire story to be out free of charge for everybody to hear. So I'm going to do that for her. But she said, look, I have written affidavits from the people that are mentioned in my book. They have corroborated my story. And she has situations where she's been able to tell people things from across the country that she would have never known had she not have had some sort of a telepathic communication and or connection with gray aliens. So there's a lot there. But here's my question to you. When we have those kind of stories that are really out there, and I get a little defensive, that's on me as a host of the show. I get a little defensive when people start coming for my guests like that because they say, oh, they're crazy, they made it up, they're a liar. Here's what I say. You realize we're talking about Sasquatch, right? We're talking about an undocumented and unscientifically proven, what I believe to be a 7 to 10 foot tall bipedal ape roaming around in North America. That's not crazy at all if you're a hunter who says they see one from their tree stand. But if it goes outside of that, people have a really difficult time with it, which I understand. That was a really long-winded question, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is, how do we deal with and how do we process those kind of really out there stories that involve multiple layers when you believe that this person is 100% sincere? I mean, she looked me in the eye. She got very emotional during one part of her story when she was talking about her dog being involved in a situation where she didn't have control over what was happening with her dog that was directly related to some of these extra terrestrial and or Bigfoot experiences that she was having. That's a very real reaction that people have. I don't have psychological training. I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. So I do the best I can with my law enforcement training to sort of sift through that. So I'll start with Emma. There's a question there somewhere, Emma. Maybe you found it already, but my point is, as a person who takes this subject very seriously, and I want to be respectful of everybody's experiences, how am I supposed to approach that when it is really, really out there? And are these people to be believed, or is there possibly something else on board that's causing this to manifest and come out?
Okay.
Great question.
So what I would say to you is you are an excellent interviewer. You are respectful and you're coming across with a very balanced approach. So myself and John, we're psychologists. We are scientists at the end of the day. We hopefully are doing the same thing. We're trying to be open-minded and look for evidence, whether it's in the narrative or in stress reactions in the voice. So hopefully we're coming to the equation and being open-minded, which is what I see you do on here you do on every show. So I think you're taking, a really scientific approach just naturally. So in terms of narratives being very out there, the world is a very mysterious place. We've got a situation now where we've got the American government openly showing videos of these. If you've seen the Tic Tac UFO, they're putting that out there. So you've got the US government acknowledging that these things are not fake. They've been shot by a pilot. They've been videoed. So if you've got the government putting those things out there, you have to kind of acknowledge that, don't you? So you're listening to a narrative. Somebody's talking about their encounters, and they're also talking about an alternative subject, which is, equally out there, so to speak. But we just have to look at it neutrally and look for evidence. So I haven't heard the one, it obviously hasn't come up yet, but I did hear the podcast about the sexual encounter. Now, again, being respectful to the witness. I'm not going to talk about that encounter per se, but there are signs of when people are making things up. So, for example, there might be a lot of detail before the. So, hypothetically speaking, not wanting to run anybody down, but if I was making up a story about having sex with a Bigfoot, so to speak, you might expect to hear me giving a lot of detail before the sexual encounter, giving a lot of detail about this, that, and the other. But when it comes to what you would call the money shot, the actual sexual encounter, you might gloss over it because it is made up. So if there's a lot of omission around the actual interesting part, that would be a strong red flag. John, would you agree with that?
Yeah, although somewhat controversial, I did a show on neurolinguistic programming, eye movements.
Yeah.
And if you take the time to establish a baseline for how people process information, I think there's a lot of validity to that when you do it right. So I think that's another indicator of whether people are constructing a story which could be involved in lying, but also depending on how the question is asked, they may need to construct a story. So again, you've got to be careful on how you gauge that versus somebody who's remembering an actual event. They're going to have a different set of eye movements for that story. So I forget the number of the episode, but it was called The Bullshit Detector for Sasquatch Stories. I wanted to key in on your science issue as well. As scientists, and one, I got to apologize because I chuckled at the the story about the gentleman having sex with a Sasquatch, and I really shouldn't have done that. I coined a term called incredulity bias. And in incredulity bias, somebody tells you a story that's so far out of your realm of your worldview that about the only answer you can muster is like, what the heck? No way that happened. It's got to be BS. And especially considering, as has been pointed out by Brian, that we're dealing with a species that hasn't been scientifically proven. We've got to be very careful about incredulity bias, because for the Sasquatch community, it's one thing we believe, but we're a small portion of the overall world population. And just the existence of Sasquatch in and of itself, let alone some of these woo type stories or this sex story, can be out of the realm of the general population's worldview, and they will develop that sense of incredulity and that nothing like that could possibly happen. The other point I wanted to make, picking up on science, it's our job, and kind of echoing what Emma has said, it's our job to remain as open and objective as possible. And in our Bigfoot community here in the United States, there are highly credentialed people who fail to even be open to the possibility of telepathy and other woo experiences. And I think, again, I would put that under the category of incredulity bias. But I think they and we as scientists or aspiring scientists, need to really guard against that. I've got an experiment in my mind that I've been kicking around to measure mind speak. And of course, the experiment requires a good telepath. And when I brought that up in another group, I discovered that, in fact, somewhere outside of Washington, there is a whole institute where people can go to be trained to bring out their natural telepathic skills. I think telepathy is much less accepted in our culture than it is in other cultures throughout the world. The Russians have been doing experiments with that various aspects of telepathy and telekinesis and remote viewing and so on and so forth for a long time. So it still exists. And I do believe that telepathy is kind of hardwired into our brain. But I think through our rearing in a Western culture, that is really discouraged early on in our childhood. The imaginary friend. Oh, no, you don't, that's not real. It's just a pretend imaginary friend. And I think we teach our children, rather than thinking outside of the box or outside of the lines, we teach them to think within that box and within the lines. And in doing so, we limit some of these capacities and make them inaccessible as it could be. So I think back to the Dark Ages, before microscopes were existing. What did you do? You went to the barber for a bloodletting. That was a frequent treatment, no matter what the condition was. And then the microscope came along, and they discovered germs. Well, you can't see germs, and it took a long time for people to acknowledge and accept that something that you can't see could cause disease and illness, because how can it affect you if you can't see it? And I think woo phenomena is falling into that same kind of trap, in that it gets a lot of skepticism because it's outside the realm of so many people's world's view. And so, but when you think about it, where would medical science today be if that kind of skepticism and bias against germs would have prevailed? You know, we certainly have a shorter lifespan and a lot more diseases. And I think similarly with woo, I think as a scientist, or some people consider psychology a pseudoscience, but be it a pseudoscience or a science, we have an obligation to remain open to these kind of phenomena. Interdimensionality. I mean, there's a foundation for it in quantum physics, entanglement theory, string theory. So, you know, we got to keep our minds open and not be so judgmental.
I totally agree. I'm very interested in psychic phenomena. I've actually trained myself in what we call in the UK development classes. So as somebody who was very scientific and not interested in psychic phenomena, I've actually developed those abilities myself, because I see everything as energy. You know, if you think in terms of Einstein, he's meant to have channeled through the theory of relativity, and people like Newton also were very much open to channeling things from other realms. There's a long history of it. And if you look at animals in the wild, you know, the way a flock of birds will be in sync with each other, you know, it is, like John's saying, probably ability that we just are filtering out. We're choosing not to, well, you know, if we were to suddenly go into a forest and have to live with, you know, our senses would become heightened and we'd be much more intuitive. We'd have to be, wouldn't we? We're just not using those senses on a regular basis.
Yeah, it's one of the things that has really, frankly, it pisses me off about the community is, you know, some of these out there stories are hard to digest. Wayne and I just recorded an episode for this show. In the future, it was all about a lady who wrote into another channel and talked about her experience of, she gave birth to a Sasquatch baby, basically, is what it, in a nutshell, is what it boils down to. And one of the things that when we heard the story together and talked about it on the show, when we were recording, I said to Wayne, what stuck out to you? And the first thing he said was how sincere that this lady was, how well written it was, and how sincere she was about her experience. Now, of course, it was being read by somebody else, so it's very hard to gauge the emotions and what's going on behind that. But you could tell by the words that she wrote, she was very serious about the story. Now, she could have completely made it up and it could be something that's completely out there. But again, it goes back to, in the community, I say the Sasquatch community at large, it appears to me, and it's been my experience, and I'll speak from that specifically, my experience. When you start talking about these out there incredulity bias sort of aspects of this, if it's outside the realm of what you believe to be possible, people poo-poo the high strangeness and the woo. I get that on some level because I've done that in the past, but I've opened my mind up to, if we're talking about, if this species exists, and I believe that it does in some capacity, I believe it to be a flesh and blood creature of some sort, could be wrong. But if it exists at all, who's to say that these out there stories aren't possible? Why couldn't this lady have had the experience that she had, which was a very traumatic experience? Could that be possible? Sure. If they exist, could they do that? Absolutely. Same thing with this gentleman who claimed to have had this sensual encounter when he was a young teen, early 20s on a camping trip. If they exist, that is possible. But the people who say, well, you know, it doesn't fit in what I believe, so it's not possible, I'm not picking up what they're putting down. So I think that's a good way to end that portion, is just saying, keep an open mind and be willing to experience and listen to everybody's experiences, because I think there's something to be gleaned there. Here's something that I know that Wayne has something to say about, and I certainly have something to say about. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about, it's in the open of the show, the red circle squatches, the pareidolia. Pareidolia in and of itself is a known phenomenon. It's something that we experience and we see, and that part to me is easy to explain. Here's the problem that I have. It's almost like, and I think, John, you said this a lot more eloquently earlier on. I think it's not even called mass hysteria anymore. It's something much more eloquent the way you said it. But it's this idea that I can get people seeing something that I can't see in a photograph. You know, they want to see Bigfoot really badly, so they pick out, there's a face, there's a Bigfoot in the photo that I can't see. Here's the thing that's been really interesting to me, and I think Wayne can probably echo this. It happened to me recently. I had somebody on that I interviewed who had a Class A sighting of a Sasquatch, recorded some audio, and now they're posting pictures on Facebook of trees and leaves with nothing there. And here's what happens. Here's a picture, and then you get the comments. Comment after comment. Oh, there's multiples there. Good catch. I see all the different faces. It is literally leaves and trees. But you have multiple people in this thread talking about what they see in these leaves and trees. So I get pareidolia. I experience it myself. I think it was Doug that I talked to, Doug Hychek, way back when. I think he actually said it on the show one of the first times I interviewed him. He's like, look, dude, I see Sasquatch every day in my shower and the water droplets on the wall of my shower because I have Bigfoot on the brain. It is a thing. But let's go to Emma first and talk about pareidolia is one thing. I think we all kind of get that. What is happening with these red circle squatches and the pareidolia that is seen to be shared by these other people? Is it just something that they want to be true? Are they just propping this person up? Talk a little bit about from a much more sophisticated perspective than I've been able to articulate it. What's going on when that's happening?
So I touched on it on the last time we talked, that the brain is hardwired to see faces from birth. A baby, there's psychological experiments where you'll take the shapes of eyes and nose and mouth randomized, or the one which is in the pattern of a human face, and the baby will always stay longer. They monitor eye gaze, and they'll always stay longer at the human face as configured correctly. So from it's in us to see faces. So from a perceptual perspective, it's in us to do that. So that you've got that issue. You've also got again, you could possibly say that it's the in-group psychology going on within, say, it's the Sasquatch Odyssey Facebook group, for example. We are a community. So again, we've talked about confirmation bias in the past. So we've got a group of people on the Facebook, your Facebook page. They're not normal people, so to speak. They've got predominantly a bias towards wanting to see Bigfoot. So if you were to put it out there to everybody on Facebook or your community, that you would expect there to be a stronger number of people within your Facebook page are going to see Bigfoot because that's their worldview and they're looking to see it. So you've got the aspect of confirmation bias. You're also touching on the issue of suggestibility. So again, you do have pack mentality. You only need there to be more than 3 people saying one. There's famous experiments within psychology. For example, it was an old experiment. I think it was by Ash. And they were lines of different number, different size lines. So 2 long lines and 1 shorter line. And as soon as there were more than 3 people who were in on the experiment, there was 1 person who was a real subject in the experiment. And as soon as there were more than 3 people who were in on it, saying all those lines are the same, the real person would conform and agree and say, yes, all the lines are the same, even though they clearly weren't. So you only need more than 3. That's the magic number for people to start agreeing. So that's suggestibility. In terms of the concept of mass hallucination, so to speak. There's multiple reasons why that could come in. You've got, again, social pressure. You've got just, there's so many different things. I'll turn to John now. Anything you can add to what the kind of points that I'm raising?
Sure. And at the risk of hawking my show, my live YouTube show and my book too much, I would draw the audience's attention to, I did a 2 or 3 show expose, if you will, or treatment of bias. And there's lots of different reasons for bias. But I want to pick up on something you said about the difference of, well, what perception is, and differentiate that from sensation. When you reach down and pick up what looks like a not on fire log around the edge of a fire, it looks burnt, but it doesn't look like it's flaming. And you pick that up and it is still scorching hot. That signal traveling from your fingers and your hands, up your arm, up into your neck, into your spinal cord, and then the millisecond before it enters your brain, that's called sensation. It's the raw neurotransmitter phenomena of feeling that hotness. But the millisecond it hits your brain and your brain begins to process it, then it's called perception. And perception is informed by our life experiences and our world and our teachings. And as a result, I continue to say we're hardwired to be biased, because not everybody has had the same upbringing and shared the same experiences, not even twins. And so we can't, on one level, not that everything we say is biased, and not that everything that is biased is wrong, but we're hardwired biased machines, and it's very easy to slip into various types of bias. Emma mentioning confirmation bias being one of the biggies in the Bigfoot field. When I go on an expedition, I'm thinking about the expedition all week. As I drive to this location, I've got Bigfoot on the brain. You get there and you start talking with other people who have got Bigfoot on the brain. And so the stage is set to more easily attribute things we experience in the woods to Bigfoot rather than other possible considerations. I think that's irrespective of what you think of BFRO. One of the things they insist on is ruling out all other possible explanations for the experience you just had prior to attributing it to Bigfoot. And I think that's a good adage to follow. There's something called figure ground phenomena. And again, on the show, I've got an illustration of it, but you look at this picture, and for some people, immediately what comes up is a white urn. But as you look at it longer, oftentimes you also then notice 2 black faces in profile facing each other. And that goes on a lot on an expedition. We typically give the Sasquatch high ground. So we're using ourselves as bait. We're down low, they're up high. And oftentimes when you arrive at your area for the night, we sit there and we start staring up at the sky and the mountain ridge. And the probability of having a figure ground phenomena comes in hugely there, because the trees can form a figure and the sky can be the ground, or depending on how many trees there are, it can reverse itself. And so the combination one combination of Bigfoot on the brain and looking up at ridges and experiencing figure ground phenomena, put those two together, and you can end up seeing things that other people don't see. Not saying this is going on, but on one of my earlier expeditions, there must have been about 8 of us in the group, and everybody was seeing a Bigfoot up on this ridge. And I had people pointing it out to me, and I just couldn't see it. I just may have missed it. But in terms of trying to enhance your objectivity, confirmation bias, figure ground phenomena, pareidolia, visual and auditory illusions, those need to be on your little check-off list to make sure that that's not what's going on before you attribute it to Bigfoot.
I think that's really interesting point, but you can flip it as well. You can flip the point. Going back to my PhD topic, theory of mind, in terms of figure ground, I find it very fascinating that the way that in the eyewitness encounters, Bigfoot is seen to be behind the trees. It's almost as if they got a concept of something like figure ground that they know to break up their outline. So it's having a concept that they have insight into what we are perceiving. So that's a theory of mind aspect, which is a very human phenomena. So, flipping it, it's very interesting to look at it from potentially a Bigfoot's point of view, perceptually, that they're knowing to break up their outline.
Absolutely.
Wayne, I know this is a big thing for you. Do you have anything to add to the red circle squatches and this whole, it's almost like mass hysteria that goes on in some cases when people start seeing Bigfoot everywhere, whether it's tree structures or in the pictures? What say you, man?
No, I mean, you did beat me to it. That was going to be my next question, was not just the pareidolia, but Brian and I almost daily, we will text each other these different red circle squatch pictures that go around Facebook. We're talking about it all the time, and it just pisses us off because they're everywhere. But even more so than those pictures, it's the comments. Like y'all were talking about, there's always 20 people. Awesome find, brother. Good job. Did you see the other 4 that were in there? Look at the facial expression on this one. I'm like, are you fucking kidding me? The facial, you can make out the facial expression. You're telling me that you see it so well that you can see if it's smiling or not. And these people are they're so passionate about it, and you cannot tell them. It's happened to me before. This guy got so pissed off that he cussed me out and left the group because I just told him I'm not seeing it. And he just could not fathom. He thought I was making fun of him or something. And I wasn't. I was respectfully telling him, I want to see what you're telling me. I just don't. And he got so upset and mad that he literally was calling my mama names and stuff. And then left my group and all kinds of stuff, man. I mean, he was just pissed off. I wanted to see what he was talking about. I couldn't. And I'm not going to tell anybody that I can. I don't know. I don't get how passionate these people are that they're actually seeing something.
I suspect Emma's more well versed in social psychology than I am, so maybe she might want to add to what I'm about to say. But I think you referred to it, Emma, as the pack mentality, and I think that process might be going on with those pictures. And people want to believe, and they need to believe. And when somebody puts up one of those pictures and says it's clearly a Sasquatch, and you look at it, if you join in with that, there are certain rewards associated with believing and validating that person than if you take a skeptical approach, as you, or not even skeptical, objective approach, as you were just describing. So I think there's a social phenomena going on there. How about you, Emma?
Yeah, definitely agree. I mean, it links to what you said earlier, though, how hardwired the brain is to make sense of things. The figure ground information you were talking about, that's all from the kind of Gestalt psychology of how we're trying to, just connect all these different rules from Gestalt psychology, that we're always trying to, find an image. The brain is wanting to do that. It's just, it's it is social, but it is also to do with pattern recognition. The brain is hardwired to find patterns, particularly faces. Now, if you're getting somebody being abusive towards you, I mean, that would be a red flag for possible underlying psychological conditions, possibly. I mean, I don't know the person, I don't know the comments, but so when people are becoming extreme in their reaction, that is what I would consider to be a red flag. But on mass, when people aren't being disrespectful and just being passionate about it, they're fighting the tendency of the brain to want to fill in the gaps, and it's an incredibly strong tendency. It would really lend itself to some really good psychological research to actually systematically put, and then actually you could compare one group with the other, just where you've got there is an image there, even if it was a fake Bigfoot mask put in, even though there was something just real as opposed to just leaves, you could actually have two conditions, couldn't you, and compare and get statistical results to see what was going on there. That would be interesting to do.
I'm having a hard enough time getting people to rally around using signs to examine Sasquatch, let alone using signs to examine Sasquatchers. That might be a bit of a challenge. I don't know.
I think you're right there, John. I definitely want to be respectful of everybody's time, and I want to get in a few phone calls if we can before we get out of here. So I'll throw this out there, and it may not even be relevant in the totality of the psychology of Sasquatch. But here's the thing that stuck out to me, that I know this is another thing that Wayne and I have talked about recently that has really frustrated both of us, is these sort of habituation situations. And this is one of the things that I wrote extensively about in my book that'll be out at the beginning of 2024. Shameless book plug here. Sasquatch Unleashed: The Truth Behind the Legend will be out in 2024 for you guys. But is these habituation situations, and it sort of goes along with what we're talking about with the pareidolia, and in a lot of cases, the lack of proof that we have with some of the habituation situations that I know Wayne has documented and I have documented. We're not going to call anybody out specifically by name, but there's a couple that comes to mind that are pretty much prominent in the Bigfoot community. And I'll just ask you real quick, both of you, to sort of touch on this, if you would. Let's talk a little bit about it from the psychological standpoint of these habituation situations. And we're talking specifically about somebody spending decades interacting with Sasquatch, sometimes to the point of them traveling to other states with these people, and there being this lack of any type of physical evidence. And it almost gets to, okay, these things are following you from state to state. And I say, okay, well, if you've spent 30 years with them, you should have photos. Oh yeah, I've got tons of photos. And you get blob squatches and red circle squatches. Can you talk a little bit about what may be an underlying situation with that? Do you think it's possible that they're having these situations and there may be something else causing that? Or is there a possibility that there's some sort of a psychological or maybe personality trait that's going on that's affecting these habituation stories, if you will? Emma, you can take that first, and then John can close out with that.
I mean, from a psychological point of view, habituation is a real psychological phenomenon. So if you are feeding Bigfoot, it's very likely that they would become habituated. If you were to pick up a snail and touch its head, it's going to pull back in straight away. But if you then touch his head a second time and nothing awful happened to the snail, within seconds it stops pulling his head back in, and that's how quickly habituation can potentially happen. So if you're rewarding an animal, it is likely that habituation is real. So I'm not going to dismiss that that's a possibility. Now, you're picking up the point that they got no evidence to support it. That's a different point, isn't it? So you've got two things going on there. is the habituation real? Which is a possibility, definitely. But if there's no evidence, then you have to question that in terms of why is there no evidence? So have you had any evidence at all from anybody who's saying there's habituation?
Every time I've had a habituation situation, and maybe Wayne could even chime in, but I think I know the answer. Every time I've asked for that evidence, I've gotten 15 or 20 pictures that's blob squatches or red circle squatches that appear to be nothing more than pareidolia for me. Wayne, have you experienced anything different?
Exactly what you just said.
So with the individuals in these situations, are there any red flags for you when, you know, that might hint at an underlying personality disorder or anything of that nature?
I mean, it's definitely hard to say because I go in usually with a blank slate with people and I let them build upon that. There's sometimes that they're very convincing. They seem to believe, and that's something we really didn't touch on that maybe we can even talk a little bit about now. There's that whole category of where I sort of put these encounter stories. Some of them can be very out there, and I think they fall into a few categories. They happened as exactly as they said, and they had a experience with probably what was a Sasquatch. They made their story up entirely whole cloth, and none of it's true, or it happened, and maybe it only happened in their mind. So I don't know. It's very difficult to say in a lot of those habituation situations. They seem very convincing. They seem to be convinced that they had the experiences that they're sharing over the course of these many decades in some cases, but it's difficult to say. So I don't know if that answers your question or not.
So again, trying to put a scientific head on, you know, on us looking in at the situation. So obviously we can't go back in time and get evidence, but if they are in a habituation situation, they've got the potential then to collect evidence in the future. Would they be open to that? Is there any way that the evidence could be collected?
And in their mind, Emma, they're already collecting it. Those
So
pictures
what
should be enough.
right, okay. I mean, it's because I'm quite a visual person, so I'm talking hypothetically, so I can't see the pictures at the moment. So, you know, it'd be interesting to see the pictures, but you would think then that you could get better pictures or prints, you know, can they put stuff down where they're going to get prints? Like in the, you know, I don't know, the peanut butter, trying to be token American. I don't know. So without hearing the narratives of what they're saying, it's very hard to say. So if there's a lot of elaboration, you know, so if it was somebody who was schizophrenic, for example, you might have kind of like a tirade of conversation. You know, one thing would be going on to another, be very chaotic, very disorganized in the narrative. Often people aren't very good liars. They might lie, but then usually there's holes which you can pull apart by good questioning. So I'm struggling a little bit because it's hypothetical. I can't actually hear what they're saying or see the pictures. John, have you got anything to add?
Boy, habituation for me is a dicey issue. Very dicey. Number one, when does habituation occur? And to what degree does the animal, or whatever Bigfoot might be, become truly habituated and begin to act natural? If anybody has seen Ron Moorhead's picture of the camp that he lived in when they were making those recordings, when they arrived there, that was in a bit of shambles. And so they had to work quite a bit to reconstruct that and secure that and make it a viable shelter. And so certainly the Bigfoots were around and probably observing that at that point. And so one would argue that the time it took them to set up camp and reconstruct this shoulder, maybe the creatures were already becoming habituated. But the fact of the matter is when you stop to measure something you change what you're measuring.
Mhm.
And so, you know, his record, and I'm not calling into question his recordings at all, but that was going on with the creatures certainly knowing that a human being was there. And so is that their naturalistic behavior? Is that how they behave all the time? Or was that how they behave in front of a human? And if you listen to those tapes, sometimes it sounds almost like they're reacting to the humans, or dare I say, I'm probably projecting here myself, but almost like they're conversing about the humans across the river. The other thing that I want to say about habituation is who are we talking about? Are we talking about the Bigfoots habituating to the humans, or are we talking about the humans habituating to the Bigfoot? And I think that's a perspective that's got to be considered in terms of habituations. The last point I'd make on that, and I'm going to make a lot of people unhappy, because Wayne and I have talked about this as well. And in fact, just on a website that I just joined just a day or two ago, as I was introducing myself, I made a case against blob squatches and said, if you have to circle it, don't publish it, because it just ends up creating controversy and a logical debate, which, although they can be convincing, they're not science. But having said that, I hadn't thought about this before, but then we look at FLIR, and some of the blobbiest squatches, pictures of the blobbiest squatches I have seen are FLIR. You know, the heat lights them up so you can see there's a figure there standing out, but depending on the distance, sometimes it could look almost more like an elongated egg, with the different heat levels. But yet we're quick to accept that finding, and not as quick to accept the blob squatches. And not that I'm encouraging blob squatches, because I really don't, but I do think we need to be careful with technology, and I think we need to be careful with attributing Bigfoot to that blob-like figure just because the colors are lighting up. We still, unless it's close enough that you can really make out an outline, we're still making attributions of what that creature is with the FLIR, and so bias still can factor into that.
What popped into my head as well was, just again from the Galstar perspective, just the very act of drawing a red line around something, again, is one of the Galstar principles of enclosure. So the act of drawing the line is, again, forcing the brain to look for a pattern within the border of the line. So, you know, that's another factor too.
If I could just quickly jump in to clarify what Emma is saying, there's this school of thought in psychology. I pronounce it Gestalt, and she's nicely elucidated what it is. You can be given a picture of a disjointed object that's not well formed or connected, and our brain can connect the dots, if you will, or connect the disparate pieces into a whole. Gestalt means whole. And so, again, that's one of those hardwired things that our brain does. We want to form a whole out of disparate and different parts.
Very well said. I have put the ticker up. If you guys want to call in and be a part of the show, feel free to do so. We haven't heard a ton from our co-host extraordinary. Tiffany, do you have anything to say about some of the things we've talked about, or maybe something we haven't talked about tonight while we're waiting on folks to call in?
I'm a good listener. So, you know, no, but I can say, based off of listening to yours, Wayne's conversation, you guys say you're better interviewers because of that, but we are better listeners because of that, because we can take the information that we learn from that and that we learn from this show and apply it to interviews or whatever encounters that we listen to, and it makes more sense to us. And coincidentally, I listened to 2 interviews last night, same podcast, two different people, and I was able to apply what I heard from Emma based off of their reaction. And it definitely fell on the line for the PTSD trauma response.
What did you hear, Tiffany?
It was I'm sorry, you got to give me a second. They were both men. They both were obviously shaking when they were talking. One of the gentlemen actually started crying. The other guy, his breaths were broken and shallow. There was no, you could tell that he wasn't BSing, in other words. But I think it's imperative that we have these conversations because it's part of it, right? People don't want to take this side of it into account, but you kind of have to. So
it looks like we've got a caller. I'm going to try to get them back on the line here. So as you guys were talking, somebody called in. They are not going to be able to hear you guys. We haven't figured that out yet, but I'm going to call whoever this was back and see if we can get them on the phone and have a conversation with them because, okay, I think we're calling them now. There's always a pregnant pause when I'm calling people back. It's ringing.
Hello.
Hey, who am I talking to? This is Brian. You're on the air with us.
It's Troy.
Hey, man, what's going on? What's your question or comment?
I typed it out earlier. I was wondering, polygraph useful in determining whether or not a person is telling the truth, even if they believe the lie they are telling?
Very good question, man. I'm going to hang up and let them answer it right quick. We're going to go around the horn and let Emma do it first. Thanks for calling in, Troy. I appreciate your question, man. Emma, you want to take that first?
Yeah, I mean, the research shows that there's very mixed results with lie detector tests. I mean, as a student, as a psychology student, most psychology students get to use a lie detector test. So many, many years ago, I was hooked up to an old-fashioned one. And it was amazing. I was told to lie about an answer to something. And, you've got wires on your fingers and straight away it's picking up that a difference in your bodily reaction. I mean, that's what it's picking up, is how you're reacting. It can't see into your brain. It doesn't know if you're lying. But of course, there's ways of it's gone by is establishing a truth reaction to a known truth answer, such as your mother's name or something of that nature, and then it's comparing the truth reactions to a potential lie answer. So it's a comparative measure. So if you're able to kind of react in a like, for example, to kind of cause yourself a bit of pain on truth reactions, then you're having an inappropriate reaction to the truth. So the comparison no longer becomes as valid. So there are ways of being able to kind of cheat, so to speak, inverted commas, on lie detector tests. And what it's picking up is emotional reactions. So you might be telling the truth, but up to an answer, but if it's something that's very emotive for you, that will be picked up as well. So there is some value, but again, is far from being conclusive because it is open to manipulation in terms of how your nervous system is reacting.
John, what say you about the lie detector?
I agree 100%. Some of my training is in biofeedback, where you're hooked up to the same kind of sensors that are used in lie detector tests. And so, number one, I did 6 episodes on reconditioning your fight-flight response. if you use those techniques, you can get control over those emotional and physiologic responses, and that can be used to beat a lie detector test. I will note, although it's been a while since I've checked, but I think it's pretty valid still. Lie detector evidence is not universally accepted in courts in the United States. Some states allow it, some states don't. The best way that I've seen to beat a lie detector test is to go out the night before and get just shit-faced drunk so that you come in with a hangover and you're just kind of dull and kind of unresponsive, and the alcohol will suppress some of your, although alcohol can be disinhibiting, but if you're not a drinker and you've never had a pretty bad hangover, it's hard to imagine, but you just want to remain as non-responsive as possible in those conditions. And I know some folks who have beat lie detector tests using that technique.
Very interesting stuff. I just looked at the clock. We're almost an hour and a half in. I want to be respectful. Emma is up way past her bedtime. So I think that's a good place for us to close out. There's a ton of stuff we didn't get to tonight, but we can always do another show, folks. So I appreciate everybody in the chat, all the great questions, the amazing comments in the chat. Thank you guys for being here. Emma, John, thank you so much for bringing your expertise to the table and talking about a subject that we all love. Emma, thanks for staying up way past your bedtime. I appreciate it. Tell Mike a personal thank you from me for allowing us to borrow you tonight. And John, thank you so much for being here, man. I've had a blast talking to you guys tonight. So if you guys have questions that we didn't get to tonight, you can send us an email, Brian@ParanormalWorldProductions.com, Wayne@ParanormalWorldProductions.com, or Tiffany@ParanormalWorldProductions.com. We may have to do this again, but if we didn't answer your question on the air tonight, we will try to do that again. But until next time, we appreciate you guys. Wayne, as always, you get the last word, man.
Yeah, guys, thanks so much. Everybody in the audience, everybody, thank you for keeping it classy, keeping it respectful for our guests. We always appreciate that. And until we see you guys again, y'all be good to yourselves, be good to each other. Bye.